Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong in the very place you worked for, paid for, lived for? It's an ache you don't forget. You save, you grind, you claw your way into a home you thought would mean safety. And yet, one quiet Sunday, someone decides your presence is suspicious. Not because you were loud, not because you were dangerous, but because you didn't look like their picture of who belongs. All Malcolm Greer wanted was peace. That small, sacred kind of peace that comes from ritual hibiscus tea poured into a steel thermos. A dog-eared copy of a favorite novel tucked under his arm. The comfort of knowing that for 1 hour, just one, he could sit by the water and simply exist. No performance, no explanations, no proving. But in neighborhoods like Crescent Oaks, peace often comes with a price. Because Malcolm wasn't just a man at a pool, he was a question mark, a stranger in his own story. And someone who didn't even bother to ask his name decided to call for backup. So when 2 officers showed up, they didn't run, they didn't shout. They walked with the kind of calm purpose that says, we already know who we're here for. And in that moment, Malcolm's Sunday ritual, that fragile, quiet freedom, was shattered. But here's the thing about quiet men like Malcolm: they are not as easy to erase as people hope. Because someone was watching, someone was recording. And what started as a silent humiliation would soon turn into a conversation the whole neighborhood couldn't ignore. If you've ever been there, if you've felt that ache of being questioned for simply existing, then this story is yours too. Like, share, and subscribe, because these stories don't just belong to the people who live them. They belong to all of us. And this is where it begins, with one man, one chair by the pool, and a storm no one saw coming. Malcolm Greer was 38, a health tech professional who had just moved into Crescent Oaks, a neighborhood marketed as quiet, refined, and aspirational. People said it was a place for those who'd worked hard enough to deserve peace. Malcolm believed that when he signed the closing papers, believing those white-painted walls and tree-lined streets would finally give him what he'd been searching for his whole life, a place to exhale without bracing himself. Sundays, for Malcolm, were more than a day of the week. They were a ritual. He woke up early without an alarm, brewed a pot of hibiscus tea, and poured it into a scuffed stainless steel thermos. He picked out a book, sometimes a novel, sometimes a collection of essays, tucked it under his arm, along with a neatly folded towel. To anyone else, those items might mean nothing. To Malcolm, they were a quiet declaration: this is my space, this is my time. He liked walking the stone-paved path from his new townhouse to the community pool. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a no-loud music sign standing straight, the steady hush of water on the other side of the fence. Every detail seemed designed to remind him that this peace wasn't natural, it was manufactured, enforced by invisible rules. Malcolm understood that better than anyone. He was a black man in a mostly white neighborhood. He'd seen the guarded glances behind polite smiles at the first HOA meeting. He'd heard the hesitant greetings from a few neighbors, the kind with more pauses than words, but he hadn't moved here to make friends or prove anything. He came for one simple craving: stillness. To sit by a pool without being named, labeled, or preparing answers for questions that hadn't been asked yet. That morning, Malcolm chose a chair in the far corner of the pool deck, where the shade stretched long and cool. He set his thermos on the small table, opened his book, and took a deep breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe this was a Sunday, like all the Sundays he'd dreamed of, just a man and a chair, unbothered, unjudged. He didn't know that this very moment of quiet would be the beginning of a story that Crescent Oaks and Malcolm himself would remember for a long time. He was on page 35 when he heard an engine, not loud, but strange enough to cut through the soft morning air. He looked up and saw a black and white patrol car pulling up outside the pool fence. No flashing lights, no sirens. Everything about it was too calm, which somehow made his stomach tighten even more. The doors opened. Two officers stepped out. The taller one, around 40, had a sun-browned face and walked like someone used to people moving out of his way. The other, a little shorter and trim, had a face carved into a permanent non-smile. Malcolm didn't need introductions. He read the names on their badges, Givens and Delaney. They didn't rush, no stop right there, no barking orders. Instead, they walked toward Malcolm with the slow, assured rhythm of people who already believed they'd found the one they needed to talk to. "Good morning," Officer Givens said. His tone sounded polite, but each word carried weight. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm closed his book, resting it on his lap, and kept his voice even. "I'm reading. I live here, just enjoying the morning." Corporal Delaney hung back, scanning Malcolm from head to toe like inventory that didn't belong on the shelf. "Can we see some ID?" Malcolm nodded, pulled his wallet from the canvas bag beside his chair, and handed over both his resident card and driver's license. "Here," he said. "Is there a problem?" Givens flipped through them, then asked, "Which unit do you live in?" 214, moved in back in April. Delaney jotted something in a small notebook. "You live alone?" "With my wife. She's traveling for work right now." Givens nodded, but his eyes didn't leave Malcolm. It was a polite gaze, but loaded with the subtext. "You say that, but we're not convinced." Malcolm knew that look. He'd seen it at grocery stores, in airports, even at company parties, the look that turned a black man in a t-shirt and shorts by a pool into a suspicious person in his own story. "We got a call," Givens continued, his voice as steady as if he were discussing the weather. "Someone reported a stranger sitting at the pool." "Stranger?" The word landed in Malcolm's mind like a dull blade. He drew in a slow breath, willing his voice not to shake. "A stranger, I just gave you my resident card. I live here. Since when is sitting and reading a problem?" No answer, only their eyes, and in those eyes, Malcolm saw it plain proof wasn't enough to make him belong. He was still just a question they needed to verify. The air grew heavier, like a thin fog refusing to lift. Malcolm stayed in his chair, book closed on his lap, hands resting lightly on his knees. He held that posture like a shield. He knew that if he stood too fast, if he reacted too sharply, everything could shift in ways he didn't want. Givens handed his ID back but didn't step away. "You understand," he said, still clinging to a veneer of civility. "We have to verify when we get a call from a resident. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal." Malcolm bit down hard on the phrase. To them, this was procedure, just another box checked on their shift. To him, it was an intrusion into what he thought he'd earned with every drop of work and sacrifice, the right to exist without suspicion. He wanted to say all that, wanted to ask why a middle-aged man reading a book needed to be verified. But years of lessons held him back. Lessons from his father. From stories of men who were never allowed to be wrong, not even in a breath. Don't give them a reason to write your story for you. Then, in that heavy silence, Malcolm felt another gaze. He looked up. On the second-floor balcony of the building across from the pool stood Lydia Kane, a white woman with her blonde hair tied back, wearing a light cream sweater, leaning on the railing. She didn't look nosy. She didn't look scared. She just stood there, phone raised, its lens pointed directly at the pool. Malcolm understood instantly. She was recording. A small gesture, a silent act, but to Malcolm, it rang out like a bell. He wasn't alone in this moment. Someone saw what was happening. Someone was keeping an unerasable record. Lydia said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence on that balcony, phone in hand, had already changed the dynamic. Givens and Delaney noticed too. Malcolm caught the subtle shift in their posture. A new caution slipped into Givens' voice as he said, "All right. Thanks for cooperating. We'll update the resident who called." Malcolm gave a slight nod. No response. Not because he had nothing to say, but because sometimes silence is the only way to keep your dignity. When they left, Malcolm stayed in his chair, staring at the rippling water in front of him but thinking only of the balcony. Lydia was still there, phone in hand, holding her ground in that loaded silence. One phone, one recording. Malcolm didn't know where it would lead, but deep down, he knew this much: this story was no longer controlled by the people who thought he didn't belong here. Malcolm stayed in his chair by the pool even after the two officers left. The bright Sunday sky now felt coated in an invisible layer of gray. He picked up his book, opened it to the same page, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. He shut it again, set it on the table, and leaned back, eyes fixed on the still canopy of trees overhead. In that silence, a voice from the past spoke, so clear it felt whispered in his ear, "You don't get to make mistakes. One slip, and they'll write your story the way they want." It was his father's voice, a bus driver from Fayetteville. He'd said that on the day the two of them were ordered out of their car and made to stand by the curb because they matched the description of someone causing trouble at the mall. Malcolm was 16, trembling by his father's side. He remembered how his father had kept his back straight, his eyes lowered, and his tone calm to the point of cold as he answered every question. Later, on the drive home, his father finally spoke, "You can be angry. You have that right. But don't be foolish enough to let that anger write your fate." Malcolm had learned that lesson young. He learned how to swallow his protests, how to smile at suspicious stares, how to stay silent when treated like a stranger in his own space. It wasn't cowardice. It was survival, a code men like him had to memorize just to make it through each day. But that didn't make today any lighter. He realized he'd been preparing for this moment for years, the moment when just sitting, sipping tea, reading a book could still turn him into a reasonable suspicion. Malcolm wanted to stand up, march into the management office, slam his fist on the desk and demand, "Who called the cops? Why am I being treated this way?" He wanted to reclaim his right to exist without presenting proof, but he knew he wouldn't, not today. Instead, he took a long breath, dropped his shoulders, and willed his hands to stay steady. Because he understood every move he made here would be filtered through a different lens, a lens already set on the assumption that he didn't belong. And once the story was told through that lens, it would no longer be his story. Malcolm left the pool slowly, as if even he wasn't ready to carry this weight back home. But inside him, a quiet fire had started to burn. He didn't know where it would lead. He only knew this time, maybe silence wouldn't be enough. He hadn't even gathered his things when they came back. The patrol car was still parked outside the gate, but Officer Givens and Corporal Delaney walked in again, like there was unfinished business. Malcolm straightened in his chair, placed his hands on his knees, posture clear, easy to read, non-threatening. A self-defense habit burned into reflex. "Mr. Greer," Givens began, his tone less polite than before, "we need to verify a few more details." About what Malcolm asked, keeping his voice level. Delaney flipped open his notebook, eyes skimming the lines instead of meeting Malcolm's. "How long have you lived here?" 4 months. "Do you live alone?" Malcolm frowned. "I already told you, I live with my wife." Delaney didn't acknowledge the answer, just kept going. "Anyone else visiting guest's family?" Malcolm felt irritation crawl up his muscles. "No, I'm just sitting here, alone." Givens stepped closer, his voice lower. "You understand. We're just following protocol. Someone reported a stranger at the pool. We have to check." "Stranger?" Malcolm repeated the word in his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I showed you my resident card. Isn't that enough to prove I'm not a stranger?" Delaney finally looked up, his gaze cold. "You have to understand, We don't know everyone who lives here. Verification is necessary." Malcolm looked between them and realized these questions weren't about gathering information. They were a test to determine if he had the right to exist in this space. He leaned back, drew a deep breath to keep his composure. "So, how many questions do I need to answer before I'm allowed to sit in the chair I paid for?" The question hung in the air. Givens shifted his stance like he was weighing his next move. Delaney paused mid-writing, eyes flicking up briefly. "Would you allow us to enter your home to confirm?" Givens asked, tone soft, like that made it less intrusive. Malcolm clenched his hands, then slowly shook his head. "I don't feel comfortable letting you into my home just because I sat by the pool reading a book." This time, Givens didn't answer right away. He glanced at Delaney, then back at Malcolm. His gaze softened slightly but stayed watchful. "All right," he said finally. "We'll make a note, but you understand this is necessary procedure." Malcolm said nothing. He knew his silence was the only way to hold on to some control of this story, but in his head, a question wouldn't stop echoing. How many more verifications will it take before I really belong here? He had been silent long enough to know that silence wasn't improving anything. The questions kept coming, but they weren't aimed at information. They were aimed at his patience, his dignity. Givens and Delaney weren't investigating. They were measuring how much could a black man endure before reacting, and when he reacted, what would they write down? Malcolm lifted his eyes from the ground and looked directly at Givens. His voice was steady, not loud, but every word honed sharp. "You know, I could tell you exactly how many cracks are in the walkway around this pool, because I walk it every morning. Does that sound like something a person who doesn't live here would know?" The words landed heavy. Givens froze for half a second. Delaney stopped writing, glancing up. Just one reply, but Malcolm knew it hit where their verification couldn't hide prejudice. Givens cleared his throat, stepped back half a pace. "We just want to make sure everything's safe," he said, though his confidence had thinned. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, his tone calm but cutting. "Safe for who, me? Sitting here reading, or for someone uncomfortable with my existence?" Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that corners people with an unanswerable question. Givens didn't respond. Delaney closed his notebook and capped his pen. Malcolm knew he'd won a beat not with shouting, but by flipping the script, turning their questions into their own quiet indictment. What he didn't know was that up on the balcony, Lydia Kane was still there. She hadn't moved since the officers returned. Her phone was still pointed down, recording every word, every gesture. None of them noticed her. But every second of that footage would soon leave this poolside and enter another space, one where Malcolm no longer had to debate whether he had the right to be there. Finally, Givens gave a stiff nod, trying to reclaim authority. "All right, Mr. Greer, thank you for your cooperation." They turned to leave. Malcolm didn't escort them, didn't speak. He stayed in his chair, opened his book, and still couldn't read a word. He knew one thing: this wasn't over. Maybe it would continue in whispers, in stares, in anonymous letters. Or maybe, this time, it would erupt bigger than he imagined. On the balcony, Lydia lowered her phone, her eyes still fixed on Malcolm. She knew this footage wasn't just evidence. It was an answer to the questions he'd been forced to endure. And maybe it would make the whole neighborhood look at themselves. That night, Malcolm lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The ticking of the wall clock echoed like drops of water in a room too quiet. He couldn't sleep, not because of the chair by the pool, not even because of the two officers. He couldn't sleep because fragments of memories had begun to piece themselves together into a picture he had never wanted to look at directly. He remembered the HOA email to all residents about not holding the gate open for strangers, sent exactly one day after he held the door for a delivery driver. He remembered the unexplained looks from the neighbor walking her dog, from the man who jogged every morning, looks that made him feel like he was being tested to prove whether he deserved to be here. He remembered the anonymous note left in his mailbox. Keep the noise down. People here value peace. That note appeared the day after he'd played jazz on his small speaker for not even 10 minutes. Each small incident, one by one, he had tried to let go. He'd told himself, maybe it's a misunderstanding, maybe it's just random. But now, after being asked by police to show his ID just for reading by the pool, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. Nothing about this was random. He got out of bed, walked to the kitchen, and opened his laptop. The glow of the screen lit his tense face. Malcolm created a new folder and named it Patterns. He began combing through his inbox, taking screenshots of the reminder emails, messages from management about extra inspections of his backyard, the photos he'd taken to contest being fined for improper trash can placement, even though his bins had been perfectly lined up like everyone else's. He dragged everything into one place, organizing them chronologically, labeling each file. To anyone else, these might look like ordinary management procedures, but to Malcolm, they were dots on a map of being marked. He paused at a photo of a note someone had left on his door. Don't change this place. Keep it how it's supposed to be. How it's supposed to be, Malcolm thought. Supposed to be without people like me. He closed his eyes, leaning back into his chair, feeling a slow burning anger rise from his chest to his throat. But beneath that anger was something else, exhaustion. Because he knew that to have peace here, he had to pay a price. Not with money, but by shrinking himself, making himself smaller, becoming a more acceptable version for people who had never wanted to see him as a real neighbor. And for the first time, Malcolm wasn't sure he wanted to keep paying that price. The next morning, Malcolm woke up later than usual. He'd sat by his laptop until past 3 a.m., but hadn't done much more than gather scraps of resentment into a lifeless folder. He brewed coffee, stepped out onto the balcony, and let himself sink into the familiar sounds, the hum of a box fan, the laughter of kids playing on the faraway lawn. A normal morning, or at least, he'd hoped so. His phone buzzed nonstop. 3 unread texts, 2 missed calls. He picked it up, the first text, from a coworker. You okay? Just saw the video in the HOA group. You knew about this, Malcolm frowned. Video, the next message, from a neighbor he only greeted in passing. What happened yesterday? It's spreading. Good luck. He opened Facebook. The Crescent Oaks HOA group, usually a dull feed of tree trimming schedules and trash collection reminders, was unusually active. The newest post read, Police respond to situation at pool. This is why we need to stay vigilant. Attached was a nearly 3-minute video. Shot from above, it clearly showed him sitting in the chair. The 2 officers standing over him. No audio, but the visuals told the story well enough. Malcolm hadn't posted it. He didn't know who had, but in the corner of the screen, he saw the name Lydia Kane. Comments poured in like a flood. Weird. I've never seen this guy before. There must have been a reason someone called the cops. Funny. He lives here but still seems out of place. A few voices tried to defend him. He showed them his ID. What's the issue? But those words were drowned in a chorus of insinuations. Before Malcolm could react, the video had already left the walls of Crescent Oaks. A local advocacy page known for posting about racial bias incidents had shared it with the caption, "Just a man reading a book, and this is how he was treated." The shares climbed by the minute. The tone of the comments changed too. No longer just nosy neighbors, now strangers angry, heartbroken, or recognizing themselves in his place were chiming in, "This happened to my husband last week." Yet another example of how we're treated as suspects for just existing. Malcolm set the phone down. He didn't press play again. He didn't need to. The story had already slipped from his hands. darting out into the world like a fish leaping out of a net. He hadn't spoken a word, yet the world had begun speaking for him. And in that chaos, Malcolm suddenly realized this wasn't just about him anymore. That afternoon, Malcolm decided to walk Bruno his big, fluffy, gentle mutt as usual. He needed fresh air, needed to step away from the screens and their relentless notifications. But as he walked the familiar stone paths of Crescent Oaks, he sensed the change in the air. Mrs. Carson, who usually watered her porch plants and waved each morning, saw him from a distance but quickly bent down to fuss with her flower pots. The couple on the corner who'd once chatted about the best outdoor extension cords turned their backs, ushering their child inside without meeting his eyes. Those who didn't avoid him stared too long. Not hostile, but scrutinizing, like they were comparing the man in front of them to the one in the video they'd replayed. Malcolm felt stripped of his skin of normalcy. He wasn't just a neighbor with morning dog walks anymore. He was Malcolm from the video. Bruno tugged at the leash, stopping to sniff a tree. Malcolm stood there, spine straight, a living target for their gazes. A bitter truth dawned on him. Lydia's video had protected him from what could have happened by the pool, but it had also turned him into a symbol, a viral headline. No longer allowed the safety of anonymity. He overheard two teens walking by whisper, "That's him, the guy from the clip." One of them added softly, "He looks so harmless, and they still called the cops." Malcolm tightened Bruno's leash, not out of anger at them, but because he felt a piece of himself fall away, the part that believed he could ever just be normal here. Back home, Malcolm let Bruno into the backyard and leaned against the doorframe, staring into nothing. He realized he hadn't spoken a word publicly, but the narrative was already written. People were arguing over him, pitying him, judging him, but very few actually saw him the man who just wanted tea and a book by the pool. Malcolm wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but one thought crept in. Maybe he no longer had a choice. When silence is twisted into someone else's words, you have to speak, not just to reclaim the story, but to remind people that behind Malcolm from the video was still a human being. He turned toward the laptop on his desk. That living, breathing video had dragged the whole neighborhood into the conversation. And now, maybe it was his turn to take a deep breath and decide, would he let them keep writing his story or pick up the pen and write the next chapter himself? 2 days after the video went viral, Malcolm found an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. Cheap printer paper, blocky all-caps letters, no signature, no return address. Inside was just one line, "Stop drawing attention. We just want to live in peace." Malcolm read it over and over, each time hearing it in a different voice. Sometimes it sounded like advice, sometimes like a warning, but it always carried the same message: don't stir the pot. Stay quiet. He set the paper down on the kitchen counter and sat still for a long while. Those words weren't unfamiliar. He'd heard them his whole life in different forms, co-workers urging him to keep the peace, neighbors telling him don't make a big deal. It was always sugar-coated as concern, but underneath, it was a command. Don't make us uncomfortable. Don't make us face the truth. Malcolm felt anger rise, but also a deep weariness, because he knew the letter hadn't come from one person. It came from a mindset, a belief that peace means preserving the status quo, no matter how unjust it is. He thought of his father. He used to tell stories about neighbors saying, "Don't stir things up. People here don't like trouble." But his father still filed complaints when cops stopped him for no reason. Still taught Malcolm that sometimes making a fuss is the only way to survive. Malcolm opened his laptop, ready to email the HOA, but stopped. He knew if he asked outright, they'd deny it. They'd claim ignorance or worse, use the same language from the letter to pacify him. "We just want everyone to feel safe and peaceful." He left the kitchen table and stood by the window, looking out over his small yard. Bruno lay under the tree, sleeping in the shade as if the world outside had nothing worth worrying about. Malcolm wished he could be that unbothered, but he couldn't. Not when letters like this were reminders that someone was watching him. He folded the paper and slid it into the drawer with the warning emails and photos he'd saved. One more piece of the puzzle, another dot in the picture he could no longer pretend not to see. And in his mind, one thought crystallized if the peace they wanted meant his silence. Maybe it was time to shatter it. That afternoon, Malcolm heard a knock on the door. He opened it to find Lydia on the porch, holding an envelope identical to the one he'd received, but with none of the calm her usual demeanor carried. "You got one too, didn't you?" she asked, skipping any pretense. Malcolm nodded. "A note telling me not to draw attention. I'm guessing yours said the same." Lydia lifted her envelope. "No. Mine's worse. An official warning from the HOA. Says I filmed without permission violated community privacy. Threatens further action if I continue." She handed it to Malcolm. The paper was more polished than his unofficial letterhead, a long-winded title, Notice of Violation, but every line had the same purpose to shut her up. Malcolm read it and sighed. "They want you to take the video down. They didn't say it outright, but they want me to get the message." Lydia crossed her arms, eyes on the quiet street. "They call this protecting peace. But I see it now here. Peace just means pretending nothing happened." Malcolm stayed silent. He knew she was right. Her letter and his anonymous note were just two versions of the same idea, peace through enforced silence. "You know," Lydia said, her voice softer now, "when I filmed that video, I didn't think too much about it. I just knew I couldn't stand by, but now they're making me feel like I'm the problem. Like I'm the threat to their so-called stability." Malcolm looked at her. Really looked and saw, for the first time, frustration clouding the face of someone who usually seemed so composed. "You're not wrong," he said. "What they want to protect isn't peace. It's the privilege of not having to face the truth." Lydia gave a short, bitter laugh. "Well, I guess we ruined that for them." They stood there in silence for a moment. Two people from different apartments, different races, bound by one shared understanding that keeping quiet was just another way of keeping a broken order in place and that they had both just broken it. "What are you going to do?" Malcolm asked. "Not take the video down." Lydia didn't hesitate. Her voice was steadier than her tired eyes. "I'm sending a response, and I've got a cousin who's an attorney. She's helping me draft it." Malcolm nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. Maybe this time, he wasn't alone. Lydia slipped the envelope back into her bag, lifting her chin. "If they want us quiet, that's all the more reason to speak. You should get ready too. This isn't over." Malcolm knew she was right, and in him, the morning's frustration shifted into something sharper resolve. 2 days later, Malcolm received a copy of Lydia's letter to the HOA. It wasn't long, but every sentence cut like a blade. It wasn't just a response, it was a warning in legal language that threatening someone for filming in a public space could be considered abuse of authority, that using administrative warnings to silence a resident could open the door to litigation, that if the HOA wanted to keep pushing, they'd be facing not just Lydia, but her legal counsel. Lydia's cousin, a well-known Atlanta attorney, had drafted and signed the letter, and that signature carried weight. The HOA got the message. That afternoon, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board. The Crescent Oaks Homeowners Association affirms its commitment to protecting the personal freedoms and privacy of all residents. Recent concerns will be reviewed thoroughly and discussed at the upcoming meeting. No more threats, no more warnings. Malcolm read the announcement and thought peace and quiet. That had been their silent motto, the phrase they'd used to keep him and Lydia small. But now, it was the HOA's turn to stay quiet. That evening, Lydia called him. "Did you see the notice?" "I saw it," Malcolm said, unable to hide the faint amusement in his voice. "Pretty quiet now." "Huh." Lydia chuckled. Guess they finally learned what keeping the peace really feels like. Malcolm laughed with her. They both knew this wasn't the final victory, but it was an important moment, a small, sharp reversal, a reminder that sometimes all it takes to flip the board is one letter. He thought back to that anonymous note. Stop drawing attention. We just want to live in peace. Now, peace wasn't just the privilege of those who wanted to silence others. Now, peace meant they'd have to live with the truth exposed. Malcolm folded Lydia's letter and placed it in the same drawer as his other documents. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a bigger picture not just about discrimination, but about how it survives on enforced silence. And now, that picture had its first cracks. "We don't have to whisper anymore," Lydia said before hanging up. Malcolm stood by the window, looking out at the quiet road leading to the pool. He knew she was right. Silence had been their weapon against him, but now, they were the ones tasting it. On Saturday morning, Malcolm got an email with an urgent subject line, "Mandatory all-resident meeting. Attendance required. No details, just a date, time, and place the Crescent Oaks Clubhouse Common Room." He didn't need to ask what it was about. By the time Malcolm arrived, the parking lot was full. Shiny SUVs and sedans lined up neatly, as if even the cars were participating in this display of the peace the neighborhood loved to brag about. He'd left Bruno at home and walked into the hall. The moment he stepped through the door, he felt it thick air, heavy with caution. The common room, usually reserved for barbecues and weekend movie nights, had been transformed. Long tables covered in white cloth formed a U-shape. Every chair was taken, leaving barely any room to stand. On the wall, a big screen displayed one line in bold text: "Discussion of recent community issues." No images, no explanation. But everyone knew exactly what those issues meant. When Malcolm walked in, every eye turned toward him briefly, but enough for him to feel like he was walking a tightrope. Some quickly looked away, pretending to scroll their phones or chat with their neighbors. Others didn't. Their stares weren't openly hostile, but scrutinizing, weighing him. He spotted Mrs. Carson in the back row. She immediately dropped her gaze when he met it. The couple from the corner house leaned toward each other, whispering behind cupped hands. At the front table sat the 5 members of the HOA board. In the center was Trevor Lang, the president, a salt-and-pepper-haired man who usually dressed like he could head to the golf course at any moment. Today, his pale blue suit couldn't hide the fatigue and tension etched on his face. Next to him was Inez Shipley, the oldest board member, jotting notes into a leather-bound notebook. Malcolm found a seat in the middle row, next to Lydia. She wore a simple blue dress, but her eyes were alight, steady. "Ready for this?" she whispered. "Not really," Malcolm replied with a faint smile, "but I doubt anyone in this room actually is." They sat in silence for a few minutes before Trevor stood, tapping lightly on the microphone. The sound echoed through the room, quieting the low hum of side conversations. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Trevor began, his tone tight but trying to stay pleasant. "We know our community has been dealing with a situation that's caused concern. Today, we're here to find a way forward together." No one spoke, but Malcolm could feel the shift in the room, shallow breaths, eyes darting away. Trevor didn't need to name him. Malcolm knew everyone was here because of him. Trevor tried to keep his tone neutral. "We're aware that the recent video has sparked strong reactions. The board's goal is to clarify the facts and ensure that all residents feel safe and respected. We ask everyone to remain calm so this meeting can be productive." Malcolm heard every word but felt none of their weight. Remain calm, safe, respected. They sounded like empty slogans, polished wallpaper covering a gaping crack in the wall. The tension grew thicker when Trevor added, "We'll be reviewing our procedures and will provide updates if adjustments are needed." He was about to continue when the scrape of a chair cut him off. Lydia stood, petite, but her voice carried enough to silence the entire room. "Excuse me," she began, locking eyes with Trevor. "Are you apologizing for what happened? Or are you just waiting for this to blow over?" The air drained out of the room. Trevor froze, mouth open, but no reply ready. The other board members dropped their eyes to their papers, as if her words had ripped away the pretense they'd been clinging to. A woman in the back row cleared her throat, then said nothing. A man shifted stiffly in his chair. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the silence. Trevor took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "We are working to address this through proper channels. I understand some of you may feel this was unfair, but we have to consider the context." "No," Lydia cut him off, still standing tall. "This isn't about context. This is about a human being, a man who was treated like an intruder in his own space. And you know it." Malcolm looked at Lydia and saw what he hadn't been able to say himself: raw, unvarnished outrage. Her words were a bucket of cold water on a room trying to lull its conscience back to sleep. Trevor gripped the mic, then let go. He didn't answer her directly. "We'll open the floor for residents' comments. Everyone will have a chance to share their views." His voice was lower now, as if he was trying to wriggle out of a corner. But everyone understood Lydia had put a question on the table the board couldn't avoid anymore, and silence was no longer a safe option. The tension was taut as a wire. Trevor avoided Lydia's stare, while the others focused hard on their notes as if the typed words might shield them from the truth hanging over the room. Malcolm felt his heart thudding against his ribs. He hadn't expected Lydia to speak for him, but when she did, saying what he'd wanted to scream, he felt something loosen inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel completely alone in this room. Then another voice spoke up. Quiet, but commanding enough to draw every head. "May I say something?" It was Beatrice Vaughn, the longest tenured resident of Crescent Oaks. 70 years old, slight, a bit stooped, but her voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned her place. She slowly stepped into the aisle, her cane tapping the floor with each step, then turned toward Trevor. "I've seen this before," Beatrice said, her voice raspy but clear. "And we didn't accept it back then. We shouldn't accept it now." Murmurs rippled through the back rows. Trevor blinked, caught off guard by defiance from someone he'd always counted as a quiet ally. Beatrice went on, now sweeping her gaze across the room. "When I moved here in the late 90s, the Jefferson family moved in across from me. I remember the whispers in the parking lot, the looks when they walked their kids to school. People said they didn't belong here, but they stayed, and they made this place better." She turned back to Trevor, her tone sharpening. "And what are we doing now? Calling the police on a man reading by the pool? Sending warning letters to someone who dared to document the truth, if that's what we call peace? Then it's nothing but silence bought with fear." The room went dead still. Her words, plain and unembellished, cut straight through the defenses people had built for themselves. Malcolm looked around and saw faces shifting, some lowering their eyes, others sitting a little straighter, like they'd been forced to confront what they'd tried to ignore. Beatrice drew a deep breath and delivered her final line. "I've lived long enough to know this when we stay silent in the face of injustice. We don't just betray the person who's been hurt, we betray this community." A few claps broke out scattered, but enough to shatter the wall of silence. Trevor awkwardly adjusted his mic. Lydia gave a small, knowing smile, as if Mrs. Vaughn had just voiced everything she and Malcolm had been trying to drag into the light. The atmosphere had shifted, and Malcolm knew this was the first moment the tide felt like it might finally be turning. 3 days after the meeting, Malcolm drove downtown to meet Tasha Murray. The cafe sat on a corner of Decatur Street, where faded murals still told stories of protests from decades past. Tasha was already there, hunched over a small notebook, scribbling notes. She hadn't changed those sharp eyes, that posture that made an entire corner of the room feel like it orbited her, even though she was just turning a page. "It's been a while," Malcolm said, pulling out the chair across from her. "Yeah." Tasha looked up and gave a warm smile, though it couldn't hide the resolve behind it. "I wish we were meeting for a different reason." Malcolm let out a dry laugh. "So do I." They ordered coffee, and as soon as the waiter walked away, Tasha leaned in. "I saw the video, and the letter the HOA sent. Are you okay?" Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Okay is a big word. I'm not sure. I never thought I'd become something for people to talk about." Tasha nodded, speaking deliberately. "You didn't choose this, but sometimes the truth chooses you." Malcolm stared at her, silent. "You don't want to be a symbol. I get it. But that video, it's gone far beyond Crescent Oaks. This isn't just your story anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever been treated like a stranger in their own home." Her words left Malcolm quiet. He thought of every look, every message from strangers telling him they'd lived through the same thing. He'd never imagined his story could reach beyond the walls of that neighborhood. "I don't know what to do," Malcolm admitted. "Part of me just wants to be left alone, but another part knows I can't pretend nothing happened." Tasha put her pen down, her voice firming. "That's exactly the point. You don't have the luxury of silence anymore. If you don't speak, someone else will finish writing this story for you. You need to hold the pen yourself." Malcolm said nothing. Looking out the window, outside, a group of college kids laughed as they passed a mural painted with the words, "We are our own voice." He saw himself in that mural. He saw his father, the man who'd taught him that sometimes silence was survival. But now, Malcolm understood surviving and truly living were two very different things. He turned back to Tasha and saw not just empathy in her eyes, but a challenge. And for the first time since that morning at the pool, Malcolm felt ready for something more than just enduring. A week after meeting Tasha, Malcolm's story officially broke beyond Crescent Oaks. The Metro View Journal, a local paper known for covering social justice issues, ran a headline, "Officers Suspended," after man ID checked at his own neighborhood pool. Alongside it was Lydia's video, now public evidence. Malcolm heard about it from a coworker, who sent him the link with a note. "Seen this yet? You're in the news." He clicked and read every word. The article laid out the incident in detail. Quoting the police department, "The two officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." He should have felt relieved. Instead, Malcolm felt a hollow pit in his chest. His phone buzzed nonstop. Texts from old friends, from strangers, "Proud of you. Thank you for speaking up. You're a voice for so many of us." But instead of pride, Malcolm felt like a mannequin dragged into the spotlight. Tasha called as soon as the article dropped. "This is good," she said, excitement in her voice. "Now they can't pretend this didn't happen." "Maybe," Malcolm replied, eyes still fixed on the screen. "But I don't feel any better. It doesn't even feel like mine anymore." Tasha paused, then said, "That's the price when the truth comes out. But, Malcolm, you're not just the man in the video. You're the only one who can tell this story the way it really is. If you stay silent, they'll keep turning you into a symbol without ever knowing who you are." Malcolm leaned his head back, eyes closed. The word symbol made his skin crawl. He'd never wanted to represent any movement. He just wanted to sit by the pool with a book without being interrogated. But now his image had been turned into a rallying cry for something bigger than himself. That evening, Malcolm tried to grab takeout. On the way, a young woman stopped him. "You're the guy from the video, right? Thank you. We need this stuff to be talked about." Malcolm nodded and offered a polite smile, but inside he felt empty. Back at his townhouse, he shut the door and leaned against the cold wood. He'd become a headline, a symbol for public debate. But Malcolm, the man who just wanted a peaceful afternoon, seemed lost somewhere between the bold letters and the hashtags. He sank into the armchair in his living room, the glow of his laptop highlighting his weary face. Dozens of tabs were open: the Metroview Journal article, social media comments, emails from civil rights organizations. He scrolled, reading messages of support, criticism, and personal stories, others sharing their own encounters of being questioned, watched, or treated as outsiders in the places they called home. It hit him, this wasn't just a viral video anymore. It had become a mirror, and whether he liked it or not, he was standing at its center. That night, Tasha called again. "How are you holding up?" "Have you ever noticed," Malcolm said slowly, "that when people call someone a symbol, that person is the one who ends up forgotten?" Tasha was quiet for a moment before replying, "That's why you need to speak, so they don't just remember the image of you, they understand the person behind it." Malcolm didn't answer, but he knew she was right. Silence had kept him safe for years. Now, it only turned him into a painting for others to interpret as they pleased. He closed the laptop and stepped out onto the balcony. The city night was hazy, the orange glow of streetlights washing over the pavement. Malcolm wondered what his father would say if he were still alive. Probably the same words he'd always said, "Don't let them write your story for you." But this time, Malcolm understood staying silent meant handing over the pen to people who didn't care about the truth. Bruno padded out, pressing his head against Malcolm's leg. Malcolm knelt to stroke him, and for the first time in days, a quiet resolve stirred in him. He was done being pushed around. If he had to stand in the center of the storm, at least he'd do it on his own terms. He texted Tasha, "We need to talk about next steps." Her reply came almost instantly. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." Malcolm took a deep breath, staring out into the dark. He knew there would be interviews, meetings, maybe even backlash, but this time, he didn't feel like a pawn in someone else's game. He stepped into it with open eyes, knowing he carried not just his own story but the voices of those who'd never been heard. He hadn't chosen to be a symbol, but if the truth had chosen him, then at the very least, Malcolm would learn how to speak it in his own voice. A week after the Metroview Journal article went live, Malcolm received an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Community Policy Update." He opened it, and for the first time since moving to Crescent Oaks, those dry, administrative words made him stop and read carefully. Starting next month, contacting law enforcement will only be permitted when there is clear evidence of a violation or danger. Reports of strangers or unfamiliar individuals will no longer be sufficient grounds for automatic police intervention. Additionally, the community bylaws now include a clause prohibiting any form of discrimination or profiling based on race, gender, or economic status. Malcolm read every sentence again. No flowery language, no apology. But the message was clear. Crescent Oaks had just changed the rules of the game. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, remembering that morning not long ago when two police officers walked toward him with that casual but suffocating authority. Back then, he understood that he wasn't being seen as a resident, but as a question mark. Now, at least on paper, they couldn't use that look as an excuse to turn suspicion into procedure. That afternoon, Lydia called. "You read it yet?" "Yeah," Malcolm replied. "This isn't everything, but it's a start," she said, her tone a mix of satisfaction and caution. They didn't do this because they woke up with a guilty conscience. They did it because they couldn't keep going the way they were. Malcolm smiled faintly. He knew she was right. These new rules didn't come from compassion. They came from pressure, from the video she filmed, from the articles, from the people who spoke up, and, to Malcolm, that mattered more. It proved that silence doesn't preserve peace. It only makes injustice last longer. That evening, Malcolm walked Bruno around Crescent Oaks. The air still carried some tension, But he noticed subtle differences. A man passing by smiled and said hello. A woman watering her plants gave him a nod. Small gestures, but Malcolm recognized them for what they were: signs of a shift. When new rules didn't just live on paper but started to crack through the invisible walls in people's minds. He returned home, opened his laptop, and pulled up the folder labeled Patterns. The collection of evidence that once weighed him down now served as a reminder: things can change when someone is patient enough to connect the dots and brave enough to force others to see them. Malcolm took a sip of tea, the bitterness blooming across his tongue, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm, not because justice was done, but because now, at least, the game was being played by fairer rules. That night, Malcolm attended the community meeting the HOA hosted to discuss the new policies. He hadn't planned to speak. He just wanted to watch to see how people would react to changes sparked by what happened to him. The clubhouse was brightly lit, with plastic chairs arranged in a circle, no long tables separating the board from the residents like before. Trevor Lang, the HOA president, stood in the corner, not in his usual golf course-ready polo or a stiff blazer, but a simple button-down, as if he wanted to lower the wall between himself and everyone else. Malcolm sat on the outer edge, a few seats back, across the circle. Lydia caught his eye and gave a small nod. He also spotted Beatrice Vaughn, the one who'd spoken so powerfully at the last meeting, sitting upright in the middle, leaning on her cane. The discussion started slowly. Trevor said a few words about the importance of building trust and creating a safe environment. A few residents chimed in with comments about the new policy: how to report incidents, how to define a real threat. The atmosphere wasn't tense, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. Then, a woman across the circle stood up. Malcolm recognized her: Karen Duffy, who lived 3 doors down. He'd often seen her walking her dog, but had never exchanged more than a passing glance. "Maybe I should say this," she began, her voice a little shaky at first, then steadier. "When I watched that video, I realized something I'd never questioned before." She paused, scanning the room, as if weighing whether to go on. "I used to tense up whenever I saw someone I didn't recognize in the neighborhood. I never asked myself why. I just assumed that unfamiliar meant dangerous." The room went still. "I'm not proud of that," Karen continued, her voice dropping. "But that video, it forced me to look at myself, to ask why I think that way. And I don't have an answer except that I've lived in a bubble, where safe meant familiar, where safe meant everyone looked like me." Malcolm felt his chest tighten, not from anger, but because it was the first time someone had said out loud what he'd felt in his bones for months. Karen sat down. There was no applause, no easy affirmations. Just silence, not the defensive silence of the last meeting, but the heavy, listening kind. Malcolm glanced across at Lydia. She smiled slightly, as if to say, "See, this is what we're here for." For the first time since this all began, Malcolm felt something flicker in his chest, something that felt a lot like hope. That night, Malcolm returned to his townhouse. The streets were quiet. Bruno sprawled on the rug waiting for his usual head rub. Malcolm brewed a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. The bright screen reflected a tired but no longer hollow face. He opened the Patterns folder, the one once full of HOA warnings, trash can photos, anonymous letters, all the things that had made him feel like a target. But tonight, he didn't open it to stew in resentment. He opened it to write. Malcolm began typing, not polished, just raw. He wrote about that Sunday morning, about the feeling of being turned into a stranger on the very chair he'd paid to sit in. He wrote about the stares that made his skin feel like it was stretched over a jury stand. He wrote about Lydia's video, how it saved him from the worst, but also pushed him into the storm. He paused, thought for a moment, then added, "I'm not writing for an apology. I'm writing because I need people to understand this belonging isn't something you buy with a mortgage. It's something you build when you're seen not as a question mark, but as a human being. Malcolm sent the draft to Tasha. Her reply came almost instantly. "This isn't just an essay. This is the voice you've been searching for." A week later, the piece appeared in a local magazine focused on social justice. It didn't carry Malcolm's name, just a simple headline, "The Chair by the Pool." He chose anonymity. Not out of fear, but because he wanted the story to be seen for what it was, not for the curiosity around his name. The essay spread quickly. Someone commented, "This says exactly what we've been feeling but couldn't put into words." Another wrote, "I'm printing this out to read at our next community meeting." Malcolm read them all, feeling like his words had left him and found their way to the people who needed them, not for pity, but for understanding. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, for the first time since the police stopped him. Malcolm felt like he'd taken back what was his the right to tell his own story. He wasn't just the man in the video. He wasn't a symbol. He was simply a man speaking his truth in his own way. It was a cool Sunday morning after the previous night's rain. Malcolm slipped on a light jacket, carrying his hibiscus tea and a well-worn book. His footsteps on the stone path to the pool sounded different, not because the path had changed, but because he had. The old iron gate creaked open, revealing the familiar courtyard with its neatly arranged white lounge chairs. Malcolm chose the chair in the far corner, the same one that, weeks ago, had made him a reasonable suspicion in someone else's eyes. This time, as he set his tea on the side table, he didn't feel like he had to prepare to prove anything. He sat back and took a deep breath. The pool reflected a patchy blue sky, as if even this place was breathing easier now. Sounds that once made him tense, the click of the gate. The shuffle of sandals on tile were just background noise to a normal morning. Malcolm opened his book but didn't start reading. He let his eyes wander. On the second-floor balcony, no one was holding up a phone like that day. A few neighbors walked past the gate, stopping to greet him with a nod or a glance. A middle-aged man even paused to ask, "How's your morning?" Just that. No subtext, no suspicion. Malcolm answered with a smile. A small gesture, but he felt it deeply this time. He wasn't being looked at like a question mark. He was part of the picture here just like anyone else. Bruno lay at his feet, breathing steadily, unbothered by the past or by prejudice. Malcolm wished he could let go as easily, but he understood what had changed today wasn't just in him, it was in how this community now saw him. He thought of the essay, The Chair by the Pool, that he'd sent out. Maybe some of his neighbors had read it. Maybe it had softened a few stares, made a few nods more genuine. That thought lightened something in his chest. He sipped his tea, letting the herbal notes settle on his tongue, and realized sitting here was no longer an act of defense. It was an act of calm reclamation, a quiet declaration that he belonged here not because of paperwork or permission, but simply because he always had. For the first time since that fateful day, this chair truly felt like his, and that was worth more than any apology. Malcolm was closing his eyes, soaking in the morning, when he heard soft footsteps on the tile. He opened them to see a young couple walking toward him. The man was tall and lean, in a gray t-shirt, with an easy smile. The woman had her curly hair tied back and held the hand of a little girl, maybe 5, clutching a bright whale-shaped float. "Good morning," the man said first, his voice relaxed and unforced. "We just moved in last week. I'm Nathan. This is my wife, Callie, and this little one is Naomi." Malcolm sat up, nodding. "Welcome to Crescent Oaks. I'm Malcolm. Which unit?" "Building 3307. Callie replied with a smile as natural as if they'd known each other for years. "We saw you out here and wanted to say hello. Thought we'd let her try the pool today." Naomi looked at Malcolm, then at Bruno sprawled at his feet, her eyes lighting up. "What's your dog's name?" "Bruno," Malcolm said with a grin. "He's friendly. Want to pet him?" The little girl nodded shyly and stepped forward, while Nathan asked, "How long have you been here?" "Almost 6 months now," Malcolm said evenly, though he felt something strange stir inside him. This was his first conversation with new neighbors that didn't feel like there was a wall between them. No wary stares, no loaded questions about whether he belonged. Nathan pulled up a chair, glad to meet someone who knows the place. We're still figuring things out. Let me know if you need anything, Malcolm said, and realized he meant it, not just as polite words. Callie knelt to adjust Naomi's float, then added, We really like it here. Feels peaceful. Malcolm chuckled lightly. Weeks ago, those words would have sounded like a taunt, but this morning, they didn't carry exclusion. They were just a new neighbor's observation. Naomi giggled as Bruno licked her tiny hand. Nathan and Callie laughed too. Malcolm watched them and felt something he hadn't in a long time. Normal. Not the man in the video, not a flashpoint for debate, just a neighbor sharing space. That simple moment, a hello, a conversation, a handshake had the power to flip the story. Malcolm was no longer a question for people to pick apart. He was being seen as himself, and that was the real change. After Nathan and Callie led Naomi into the pool, Malcolm stayed in his chair, watching the water shimmer in the light, thinking about everything that had happened. There was a time when this place made him feel like an intruder, a stranger in the neighborhood he'd worked hard to live in. Now, in the same spot, he was recognized as a natural part of it. He thought back to that morning when the police approached him, their questions framed as procedure but dripping with dismissal. He thought of Lydia on the balcony, silently filming, doing what he couldn't. He thought of that tense meeting, when Lydia demanded answers, when Beatrice stood up and shattered the room's complicit silence. Malcolm closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He knew the changes at Crescent Oaks weren't magic. Nobody suddenly became better. It came from pressure, from truth being dragged into the open, from people like Lydia, Tasha, Beatrice and himself refusing to stay quiet. Naomi's laughter rang out across the pool, pure and unbothered, as if no walls had ever existed here. Malcolm opened his eyes to see her paddling between her parents' outstretched arms. He thought maybe this was the real image of peace Crescent Oaks had plastered on its brochures, not the silence bought by forcing others to swallow their voices, but the calm built by recognizing that everyone has a place here. Malcolm took another sip of his now cool tea and glanced at the empty chair beside him. He remembered his father's words. Don't let them write your story for you. Back then, he heard it as a warning for survival. Now, he understood it as an invitation to write his own story, so no one else could twist it. He stood, tugging at his sleeve. Bruno lifted his head lazily and followed. Malcolm turned his back to the pool, but before leaving, he looked once more at the chair he'd just occupied, the chair that, weeks ago, was deemed not his. He smiled, not for anyone else, but for himself. He didn't need to prove he belonged. He always did. And now, finally, they saw it too. Malcolm walked away, knowing this story wasn't over, but he didn't need a perfect ending. All he needed to know was that this next chapter would be written by his own hand. He didn't need to prove he belonged. He always did. Now they finally saw it too. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.